They laughed at the secretary until she decoded the impossible. While brilliant male mathematicians at Bletchley Park struggled with Nazi Germany's most complex cipher, Margaret Davies was filing papers and making tea. But when she quietly solved the code that could end World War II, the men who dismissed her realized they had been working alongside a genius. What happened next didn't just crack the unbreakable Enigma variant. It proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon against fascism isn't brute force. It's a mind that sees patterns where others see only chaos. Bletchley Park, England, September 1943. The sprawling Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London had been transformed into Britain's most secret weapon against Nazi Germany. Behind its inconspicuous exterior, the greatest mathematical minds of the British Empire worked around the clock to crack German communication codes that protected Hitler's most critical military operations. Margaret Davies arrived at Bletchley Park on a gray Tuesday morning, carrying a small suitcase and a letter of recommendation from her mathematics professor at Oxford University. At 23, with her quiet demeanor and unremarkable appearance, she looked exactly like what the recruitment officer had specified, someone who could blend into the background and handle clerical work without drawing attention. "Miss Davies," announced Mrs. Peterson, the administrative supervisor, as she led Margaret through corridors filled with the sound of typewriters and calculating machines. "You'll be working in Hut 6, filing reports and maintaining correspondence. The gentlemen there are working on very important mathematical problems, so it's crucial that you don't interrupt their concentration." What Mrs. Peterson didn't know was that Margaret had graduated from Oxford with the highest mathematics scores in the university's history. Her professors had quietly recommended her for Bletchley Park, not for her filing skill, but for her unprecedented ability to see patterns in seemingly random data. Hut 6 was a wooden building filled with blackboards covered in complex equations, desks piled high with encrypted German messages, and 12 of Britain's most brilliant cryptographers working in frustrated concentration. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the tension of men who had been failing to solve the same problem for 8 months. "Ah, the new secretary," declared Dr. James Wellington, the unit's chief mathematician, barely looking up from his calculations. "Davies, isn't it? Mind the tea doesn't get cold this time. We've got real work to do here." Margaret nodded politely and began organizing the scattered papers and reports that cluttered every surface. But as she worked, her eyes were automatically analyzing the encrypted German messages that lay open on every desk. The patterns were subtle, but they were there. The problem that had stumped Bletchley Park's finest minds was a new German cipher system called Sabel, the Turkish saber. Unlike the famous Enigma machine, which British codebreakers had successfully compromised, this new system used a combination of mathematical algorithms and psychological deception that made traditional cryptanalysis virtually impossible. The fundamental issue, Dr. Wellington explained to his colleagues during their daily briefing, is that the Germans have created a cipher that changes its own rules. Every time we think we've identified a pattern, the system shifts to a completely different mathematical foundation. Professor Collins, a Cambridge mathematician who had been working on the problem since its appearance, shook his head in frustration. "It's as if they designed this specifically to defeat logical analysis. There's no consistent mathematical approach that can break it." Margaret continued serving tea and organizing papers, but her mind was working on a different level. She had been studying the encrypted messages for 3 weeks, and she was beginning to see something that the mathematicians had missed. The cipher wasn't purely mathematical, it was psychological. During her lunch breaks, Margaret would sit in the corner of the cafeteria and work on her own analysis, using techniques that hadn't been taught in any university. Instead of approaching the cipher as a mathematical problem, she was treating it as a window into the mind of whoever had designed it. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October. Dr. Wellington was explaining to his team why their latest approach had failed when Margaret quietly approached his desk. "Excuse me, Dr. Wellington," she said softly, "but I think there might be an error in your frequency analysis." Wellington looked up with barely concealed irritation. "Miss Davies, we appreciate your filing work, but this is advanced cryptography. Perhaps you could focus on organizing those reports instead." But Margaret was already pointing to a section of the blackboard where the team had mapped out character frequency patterns. "You're analyzing this as if it were a substitution cipher, but what if it's actually a psychological projection cipher?" The room fell silent. Professor Collins looked up from his desk with interest. What do you mean by psychological projection cipher? Margaret moved to the blackboard and began writing equations that none of the mathematicians had seen before. The Germans aren't just encrypting their messages, they're encrypting their thought pattern. The mathematical complexity is designed to make us think it's unsolvable, but the real cipher is based on the psychological assumptions we make about how codes should work. Dr. Wellington stood up, his expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity. Davies, where did you learn this approach? I've been studying the messages during my breaks, Margaret replied. The pattern isn't in the mathematics, it's in the psychology of the person who created the system. They're using our own logical assumptions against us. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret demonstrated a cryptanalytic approach that combined mathematical analysis with psychological profiling. Instead of trying to break the cipher through brute force calculation, she was reverse engineering the mindset of the German cryptographer who had designed it. You see, she explained, filling the blackboard with diagrams that looked more like psychological maps than mathematical equations. The designer of this cipher was counting on us to approach it like traditional cryptographers. But if you analyze it as a psychological game, the patterns become obvious. Professor Collins was leaning forward in his chair, completely absorbed in Margaret's explanation. This is extraordinary. How did you develop this technique? I studied the intercepted messages not just as code, but as communication from a human mind, Margaret replied. Every cipher reflects the psychology of its creator. Once you understand how they think, you can predict how they'll hide information. Dr. Wellington was staring at the blackboard in amazement. Davies, this isn't filing work. This is the most advanced cryptanalytic thinking I've seen since we started working on Turkensabel. But Margaret was already implementing her solution. Using her psychological profiling technique, she began systematically breaking down the German cipher in ways that had never been attempted at Bletchley Park. The key insight, she continued, is that the Germans designed this cipher to be psychologically intimidating. The mathematical complexity is theater. The real encryption is much simpler, but it's hidden behind layers of psychological misdirection. Within 4 hours, Margaret had decoded her first Turkensabel message. It was a communication between German U-boat commanders discussing plans for an attack on Allied shipping convoys in the North Atlantic. The room erupted in excited discussion as the implications became clear. Margaret hadn't just solved a mathematical puzzle. She had potentially saved hundreds of Allied lives and opened a window into German strategic planning that had been closed for 8 months. Miss Davies, Dr. Wellington said, his tone completely changed from their first meeting. I owe you an apology. We've been treating you as clerical support when you're clearly the most innovative cryptanalyst in this facility. But Margaret was already working on the next batch of encrypted messages. Dr. Wellington, I appreciate that, but we have 17 more intercepted messages to decode before the German convoy operation begins tomorrow morning. Word of Margaret's breakthrough spread through Bletchley Park within hours. By evening, she was sitting in meetings with senior intelligence officers who were trying to understand how a woman they had classified as a secretary had solved the problem that had defeated their best mathematicians. Miss Davies, said Colonel Harrison, the facility's commanding officer, I need to understand how you developed this psychological approach to cryptanalysis. This technique could revolutionize how we approach German communications. Margaret's answer was characteristically modest. Sir, I approach the cipher as a conversation rather than a calculation. Once you understand that codes are created by human minds with specific psychological patterns, breaking them becomes a matter of understanding those patterns rather than just applying mathematical formulas. Over the following weeks, Margaret's psychological cryptanalysis techniques were applied to other German cipher systems with remarkable success. Her approach led to the decoding of critical intelligence about German troop movements, supply operations, and strategic planning that significantly aided Allied military operations. But perhaps more importantly, her success began changing attitudes about women's capabilities in advanced mathematical work. Dr. Wellington, who had initially dismissed her as just the secretary, became her strongest advocate. Miss Davies has revolutionized our understanding of cryptanalysis, he wrote in his report to London. Her techniques combine mathematical rigor with psychological insight in ways that traditional approaches cannot match. She has proven that genius recognizes no gender boundaries. Professor Collins, who had spent months failing to crack Turkensabel, approached Margaret after her third major breakthrough. Miss Davies, I have to ask, did you know you could do this when you arrived here? Margaret considered her answer carefully. Professor, I knew I understood patterns differently than most people, but I didn't know if that difference would be valuable until I had the opportunity to apply it to something that mattered. 6 months later, Margaret was promoted from clerical assistant to senior cryptanalyst, becoming the youngest person ever to hold that position at Bletchley Park. Her psychological approach to code breaking was incorporated into training programs throughout British intelligence services, but the recognition that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. Dr. Wellington, who had become not just a colleague but a genuine admirer of her work, made a public statement during a facility-wide meeting. When Miss Davies first arrived at Bletchley Park, he announced, I made the mistake of assuming that filing papers and making tea were the limits of her capabilities. I was wrong in every possible way. She has taught us that breaking codes isn't just about mathematical knowledge. It's about understanding the human mind behind the code. He paused, looking directly at Margaret. More importantly, she has taught us that genius can appear in forms we don't expect, and that our assumptions about who can contribute to this war effort need to be constantly challenged. After the war ended, Margaret's work remained classified for decades. The psychological cryptanalysis techniques she developed were considered so valuable that the British government continued using them throughout the Cold War. Her contributions to Allied victory were known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals who understood the true scope of her achievements. When the Bletchley Park archives were finally declassified in the 1990s, historians were amazed to discover the extent of Margaret's impact on the war effort. Her psychological approach to cryptanalysis had not only cracked the Turk-and-Sabel cipher, but it also led to breakthroughs in dozens of other German communication systems. Dr. Wellington, who lived until 1987, spent his later years advocating for recognition of Margaret's contributions. In his final interview, he said, Margaret Davies was the most brilliant cryptanalyst I ever worked with. She saw solutions where the rest of us saw only problems, and she did it with a combination of mathematical genius and psychological insight that I've never seen matched. The tragedy, he continued, is that she was hidden in plain sight for months because we were too blind to recognize that genius doesn't conform to our expectations about who can be brilliant. Margaret herself, when finally interviewed by historians in 1995, remained characteristically modest about her achievements. I was fortunate to work at Bletchley Park during a time when the country needed every advantage it could get. I simply tried to contribute whatever skills I had to that effort. When asked about the initial dismissal she faced from her male colleagues, her response was both gracious and revealing. Dr. Wellington and Professor Collins were brilliant men working under enormous pressure. They made assumptions based on the information they had. Once they saw what I could contribute, they became my strongest supporters. That's what good people do when they're given new information. The woman they had laughed at as just the secretary had proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapon against tyranny isn't the most obvious one. Sometimes it's a quiet mind that sees patterns where others see chaos. And sometimes the person who can save democracy is the one everyone assumes can only serve tea. Margaret Davies had shown that breaking unbreakable codes requires not just mathematical brilliance, but the courage to think differently when conventional wisdom fails, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the people everyone expects to be heroes, but by those who are overlooked until the moment their genius can no longer be ignored.